With a base price of about $24,000 including destination, this is not only the least expensive all-wheel drive vehicle in America, it blends that low sticker price with a practical hatchback in the rear, making this a practical and an affordable alternative to the average crossover. Now this Impreza is not the least expensive all-wheel drive vehicle in America because this is the reincarnated RS trim. At $28,795 starting, this is the most expensive and the most powerful Impreza available in the United States. But does it live up to the legendary RS name? Does RS now stand for really slow? Or have we forgotten what RS meant in the first place? If you're the kind of person that likes to take a trip down memory lane, the important thing to remember about the last time we saw an Impreza RS in the US is that it wasn't quite the same RS that we found elsewhere. It had a 2.5-liter boxer under the hood, but it wasn't terribly powerful, and it wasn't terribly swift, even compared to vehicles of its time. And so I guess you could say that this RS is not too different from that, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's talk about the design first. You can see we get the latest Subaru corporate grille up front. It looks very much like the Subaru Crosstrek because you could logically call this generation Impreza now based on the Crosstrek rather than the reverse. The Crosstrek is Subaru's best-selling vehicle. The Impreza sells in quite a bit smaller numbers, so logically a lot of the design priorities for this vehicle were here because of the Crosstrek and its success. That's also why we no longer find an Impreza sedan. The Impreza is hatchback only. It's also why we find a very streamlined lineup. There are only 3 different trim levels, and if you want the 2.5-liter boxer, this is the only way to get it. On the other hand, there's some advantages if you're looking at the base Crosstrek or the base Impreza as a result. We find the steering responsive headlights standard in all models, and these are some of the best LED headlights in this segment. They have a really great high beam and they steer aggressively in the corners. You'll really notice that if you live out in the country like I do. Down at the bottom of the bumper we find the LED fog lights and of course this very Smurf blue paint job that is exclusive to the RS trim. Let me know what you think about the design. Did Subaru do enough to differentiate this from the rest of the lineup, or is it a little bit too similar to the last generation Impreza? I have to say, I do like the look of this better than the Crosstrek because we get much more of the body-colored plastics going on, although there are still some blacked-out plastics at the bottom of the vehicle. Big difference, of course, between this and the Crosstrek is going to be ground clearance, and you will really notice that in parking lot maneuvers where you can definitely scrape the front of this bumper on parking lot headstones and some of those higher curbs. The 2 big reasons to get the Impreza over the Crosstrek are going to be styling and price. The Impreza is about $2,000 less starting than the Crosstrek, and generally speaking is going to be less expensive comparably equipped. You might be wondering, where does that $2,000 go since they're essentially the same vehicle? Honestly, I think it goes to the plastic cladding because that Crosstrek has acres and acres of it, all around the wheel arches, the doors, and the front and the back bumper. This certainly has a much cleaner appearance to it. Now, if you want Crosstrek-like ground clearance, which is epic, it's over 9 inches if you choose the right model, but you prefer this cleaner style, it's probably going to be less expensive to get an Impreza and then swap in some Crosstrek suspension components. That is entirely doable because, again, this is essentially the same vehicle as the Crosstrek. And that's why it's about the same size on the outside, 172.6 inches long. That makes this almost exactly the same size as a Kia Seltos or a Corolla hatchback, about 6 inches shorter and easier to park than a Honda Civic. Because the Civic doesn't have that traditional hatch shape in the back, it really is more of a sportback or liftback design. Now, in the United States at this point in time, there aren't as many hatches and not as many compact cars, period, available. So this is competing in a much reduced set. And if you want all-wheel drive, you have even fewer options. You have the Impreza where it's standard, the Corolla where it's available with the hybrid system that is fantastically efficient but kind of slow. And then we have the Mazda 3, which is definitely on the spendy side, and that's honestly not something we can say about the RS. In order to get to the lower sticker price, Subaru logically gives us fewer luxury touches standard and fewer options available versus some of the competition. So no model is going to get full LED taillights back here. We have LED brake lights and accent lights, but the turn signals and the backup lights, those remain incandescent. Since we're driving the RS trim, not only do we have the RS badging back there, but we have the shiny black spoiler on top of the hatch. But again, relatively little black plastic, especially the matte black plastic around the vehicle, just this tiny little trim strip right down there at the bottom of the bumper. The single exhaust tip, it's tucked up under the rear, no big exhaust tips hanging out in the back. If you want that look, that's going to be the WRX. And it's worth noting that effectively, that is also the Impreza sedan. Sales of the Impreza sedan format weren't really great. Subaru says that 80% of the shoppers were going for this hatchback format. The people that were buying the sedan were buying the WRX, and so that's why they spun it off into sort of a different model. When Subaru said they were bringing back the Impreza RS, I was pretty excited. But my excitement waned considerably when I learned what was going to happen under the hood, because this is the same 2.5-liter boxer we find in a wide variety of Subaru models. It produces 182 horsepower, 178 pound-feet of torque. This is by no means bad for a compact hatchback or compact sedan in America, but it's not really going to set your hair on fire. And that's when the Subaru folks said, well, remember that 24 years ago, in the US, the RS didn't get the kind of horsepower that it got overseas, so this actually is kind of in keeping with that original RS trim. This is notably more power than you'll find in the base Impreza, of course. That uses a 2-liter boxer producing 152 horsepower. But I honestly wish that Subaru had borrowed one of their international market turbocharged boxers, tried to find a detuned version of the 2.4 that we find in so many different Subarus, or at least put a more aggressive final drive ratio on this CVT like we find in the Crosstrek Wilderness. It's worth noting that the Crosstrek Wilderness is likely a little faster 0 to 60 than this, thanks to that final drive ratio. That's something that we've seen in some of the other Wilderness trims. The curb weight of this model is just about 3,300 pounds. It's about 20 pounds under or so. Keep in mind that the competition will offer turbocharged engines and lighter curb weight in a decent number of models. On the other hand, this Subaru continues to get impressive fuel economy. Sorry for that, I couldn't help myself. 33 miles per gallon combined in the RS trim. That is exactly the same as the regular Crosstrek. And that's because we have relatively narrow tires for the curb weight of the vehicle. Again, considering the RS badging right there on the door. 225 width tires. These are wider than you'll find in the base Impreza that gets 205s, but keep in mind that curb weight. Also keep in mind that these Yokohama tires are not the sportiest or most aggressive. But you could put wider tires on here pretty easily. This body format was designed for 235 width tires. We see those in some of the Crosstrek models, so clearly you could put wider and grippier tires on here and definitely improve the handling capability. You would just lower the fuel economy a hair. Front seat comfort is identical to the Crosstrek because, logically, the seats are identical to the Crosstrek, as are the seat frames and the seat position in the vehicle. So if you want something that is more upright as far as its driving position, and this seat doesn't go high enough for you, or you start really touching the ceiling, you're going to want to take a look at something like the Forester. This does have a different feel on the road because it is several inches closer to the road, but the way you're actually interacting with the controls in the vehicle itself is basically the same. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion, and you should know that the only way to get a power seat in the Impreza is to get a $2,000 option on the RS trim. The RS trim does not start with a powered seat by default. Now, as far as headroom goes, this model also does not have the power moonroof. That's part of that $2,000 option package. It also combines the upgraded audio system, but that does mean I get more headroom in here. So if you want to have that more upright driving position, you can get a little higher off of the floorboards in this model because it doesn't have the moonroof. Fortunately, the moonroof option does not change the dimensions of the rear seat, so we still get class-leading headroom in the back, even if you opt for that moonroof, because of the way that it integrates with the roofline. Sitting back here, I have about an inch of headroom left, definitely better than you'll find in the average compact sedan in America. That's definitely one reason you want to get the Impreza. Even if I move over here to the middle seat, where it's higher off the ground than the outboard seating positions, my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling, but my head is not touching the ceiling. If I go all the way over to the right, this seat's all the way back in its tracks. Again, plenty of legroom and plenty of headroom. Legroom is almost the best in this segment, nearly 80 inches of combined legroom. So this is going to be one of the vehicles where it's going to be a lot easier to put a rear-facing child seat behind someone 6 foot tall up front. You could do it in here, and it would be pretty hard to do in something like the Corolla. Rear seat passengers get a fold-down armrest with 2 cup holders in it, but oddly enough, we still don't have rear seat air vents. That is something that for some reason no version of this platform gets in North America, although around the world there are versions of this platform vehicle that do have air vents in the rear. We do, however, have a 3 amp and a 2.4 amp USB charge port in the back. That is kind of a nice touch. Now, one thing I've mentioned earlier in other videos is that the shoulder belt does not come out of the ceiling, it does not come out of the seat, it actually comes out of the cargo area in the back. I'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the rear. But before we get back there, I should also mention these child seat anchor locations. They are pretty handy. We get effectively 3 positions that you can latch anchor a seat into the rear because we have an extra latch anchor in the middle. Now, this does not let you connect 3 seats using latch anchors because the manual tells you you should not share the latch anchor over here on the passenger side. And one more thing to keep in mind if you do plan on using that center latch anchor position is that it is going to interfere with this outboard shoulder belt as well. So it's going to be pretty difficult to put a person in that outboard seat right behind the front passenger and have that child seat latch anchor into the middle, but I am glad that Subaru gave this a little bit of extra thought. It might be honestly a little easier if you had a narrower child seat to use the shoulder belt, but keep in mind that that seat is not going to be well centered in the seating location because of how that shoulder belt comes out of that cargo area, even though it does have this little retainer to help try and redirect it. Behind the Smurf blue hatch, we find 20.4 cubic feet of cargo capacity. No power hatch is available in the Impreza. This is almost best in class. The Honda Civic will give you an important 4 cubic feet more cargo capacity, but aside from that, pretty much everything else is smaller. The new Prius gives you 23 cubic feet, but it's not exactly the same sort of thing as the Impreza. It's quite a bit more expensive, but you could get all-wheel drive in that model. A Kia Niro will also give you a bit more cargo capacity with a bigger price tag at 22.8 cubic feet, but no all-wheel drive is offered there. And this cargo area is about the same size as the one in the Mazda 3. I was able to squeeze 3 24-inch roller bags back here. A 4th just wouldn't fit with the hatch closing, but it was pretty close. Going in for a closer look, again, you can see that shoulder belt right there. We have a roller-style cargo cover. I definitely like the fact that we get one of those in here rather than some sort of flimsy flip and fold thing. But under the floor, we don't find a spare tire, something that you will find in the Crosstrek. Now, logically, one would fit in here because it has all the mount points, but you'd have to do that yourself aftermarket. Instead, we just get a can of Fix-A-Flat right there and a tire jack. I'm sure you've guessed this by now, but the interior has largely been borrowed out of the Subaru Crosstrek, so the same sort of shapes and components are found in here. The driver and front passenger get the same adjustable height shoulder belts and same 2-way adjustable head restraints. We do get slightly different upholstery than we find in the Crosstrek. You can see in this trim, it's a combination of 3 different fabrics. There's sort of a honeycomb fabric going on right there in the center section. It has threads of red and gray and sort of a charcoal there, giving it a really interesting texture. We then have the red accents on the outside of the seats right around those bolsters, and that continues right there around that seat bottom cushion with the same sort of fabrics. We then find very similar designs to the rear seats back there as in the front. Moving over to the front doors, we find fabric on the upper section of the door, a decent percentage of hard plastics, as you'd expect for a relatively inexpensive vehicle, and then a very soft touch, squishy armrest on the door. Obviously red stitching because this is the RS trim. At the bottom of the door, we have nice big bottle holders, although I wasn't able to fit some of those larger 32-ounce drinks in there. The upper section of the dashboard is made from a soft touch injection molded plastic. We then have a soft sort of rubbery coating over this section with kind of a knurled pattern on it. You can see we don't have shiny black trim on the doors, thank goodness. Instead, this is sort of a medium gray, not quite matte, not quite shiny, somewhere between worlds, and then harder plastics down lower. This glove compartment was able to squeeze 11 of these imitation bell peppers inside. Interestingly, I was also able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Just barely closes, as you can see right there. Then in the middle of everything, you're going to find this big touchscreen LCD infotainment system. The base infotainment system in the Impreza is the same 2-screen setup that we find available in the Crosstrek as well, but most models are going to have this bigger screen here. Depending on your preferences, there are 2 advantages to the base system. We find a few more physical buttons, although we do find some physical buttons here like the hazard light button there, power and volume, tuning, and then of course climate control up and down. But we also find wired CarPlay on the base model. This is wireless only, so if you are a fan of wireless CarPlay, then you're going to love this. If you really want wired only, you're going to want the base system. Obviously, CarPlay and Android Auto both are supported here. The software is starting to feel perhaps a little bit dated, especially the design of the icons, but it is fairly snappy, and to be honest, I just end up using CarPlay most of the time. One thing I find odd is that every time you turn on the vehicle, you do have to turn on the auto vehicle hold button. I really wish more manufacturers would make that option just stick around. Up here at the top, we get some auxiliary readouts, so you can see the audio system readout right there. We also get oil temperature, acceleration, and angle, and those are adjustable, so you can actually change what is in that little button bank there. You can see there are a few different available options. Down at the bottom, we have the climate control stuff. If I pop that button there, then you can see the climate control expands to use more of the screen, and that's where you would adjust some of those extra features. And of course, we have those physical buttons for the climate control. Another nice touch is that this Qi wireless charging mat was able to charge through my thicker case. This is an iPhone Pro Max, so it gives you an idea of how much space we have down there. We also have a USB-C and USB charge port. This will also interface with the media system depending on the kind of media you're plugging in, and an auxiliary port. This is actually one of the few brand new vehicle designs that still includes an aux port in case that's something you're interested in. Down here, we do have some shiny black plastic. This is something that I really wish they would remove because you see there's already a scratch on it right there. This vehicle only has 6,000 miles on it. It's a pretty traditional console shifter with a manual mode over here, even though this does have a CVT. If you live in an area where it gets cold and stays cold for quite some time, you're probably going to love these toggle switches for heated seats. This allows the heated seat to stay on even after power cycling the vehicle, something that auto brake hold does not do. Back here we have a power parking brake, two pretty big cup holders with these little cup holder inserts right there. Kind of a funny little twist. Kind of makes me think these are really designed for the Crosstrek. There's actually kind of a mountain theme to that little cup holder donut. Over here we have a 12-volt power port, and then behind all of that we have a soft touch center armrest with a reasonably large storage area there in the middle. In the center of everything and on the driver's side, we have hard covers to the instrument cluster and the infotainment system, although oddly enough, we do find those soft touch plastics a little further up there on the dashboard. You can see we have a pretty big air vent over there, the trip computer reset button, engine start stop button, and then over here we find a partial LCD instrument cluster. The only LCD is really that small one in the middle, but I do like the crisp look of the display. This gives us things like trip computer readouts, the odometer, etc., but it's not as fully featured as you'll find in some of the competition. Subaru uses basically the same steering wheel in everything they make. This is the round version of the steering wheel. We have sport grips up top. You'll find infotainment controls over there on the left. Lots and lots of controls, I should mention. And then over here on the right side of the steering wheel, we find the cruise control controls, the aggressive lane centering assist option, and then these are basically drive modes, sharp and intelligent. So I guess you could put this in reverse and you could put it in sharp, and that would sort of be RS mode. I guess you could think of it that way. On the back of the steering wheel, we have shift paddles up on the right and then down over there on the left. Yes, this does have a CVT, so those imitation shifts, they are going to be just sort of a little mushy. Out on the road, I suppose I should set the stage for the Impreza RS. The last time the Impreza wore the RS badge, it went 0 to 60 in 8.2 seconds. This is a little bit faster, 7.8. And as you can hear, the CVT does its best to try and keep us at the best power band as long as you start from a complete stop. If I were to slow down, not quite stop, and then floor it again, then you'll notice that the CVT is going to imitate shifts. Right there, about 6,000 RPM, it's going to start imitating shifts. That means that going from 5 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour is actually a little bit slower if you start from 5 miles an hour than just crossing through the 5 mile an hour mark from a complete standstill because of those imitation shifts. Now, some folks like that. They think it makes the transmission feel more engaging. Honestly, it's just going to make the transmission a little bit slower. You can also shift with the paddles, of course, if you wanted to. Those shifts are not as speedy as they would be in a vehicle with a traditional automatic transmission. So say a Mazda 3 with a Real-Man automatic, it's definitely going to shift faster. Some of the competitors in the compact crossover segment, they're going to shift faster. On the other hand, CVTs are by far the norm in this segment, the segment that this vehicle is playing in. You could get a Volkswagen Jetta with a regular automatic transmission, but that's one of the very few options left. Of course, if you wanted something sportier, you could also get a Civic Si with a manual transmission, or an Elantra N-Line, or a Forte GT with the dual clutch transmissions. Those are certainly going to be more engaging and faster, but they're also going to be more expensive than this. And that really is the important thing to keep in mind with this RS model, is it has an RS badge, but it is not trying to be a Civic Si competitor. On the other hand, pretty much all the turbocharged competition is going to be faster than this to 60, and most of the competition is actually going to stop a little bit shorter from 60 as well. It took this model 128 feet to get from 60 miles an hour to 0, and that's likely due to the tire choice. These Yokohama tires are a little bit more efficiency focused than I might like. They're certainly not the grippiest tire, and even though the steering is well sorted, and I think the chassis is well sorted, certainly does well on broken pavement like this, you will notice that if you're on a really aggressive winding road, that the tires really start to squeal early. Bearing in mind that I wouldn't call the Impreza the kind of vehicle that begs to be driven harder, it does a pretty decent job when you do want to drive it harder, even though we get a fairly softly sprung suspension with certainly more tip and dive, more body roll than you'll find in the sportier entries. This is still a decent amount of fun to drive quickly until you hit the limits of the tires, at which point you're really going to get a lot of squeal. Now, the bright side of that is that this is the kind of tire design that squeals really early, way before it actually gives up the ghost. The problem is that the actual grip ability of the tires is fairly low, so it is actually going to give up earlier than most of the competition. But at the same time, that's why this gets a B- when it comes to the handling ability. Feel is good, grip levels not so good, and there's definitely a lot of body roll for something with an RS logo on it. Even though the Impreza doesn't have the ground clearance of the Crosstrek, ride quality is still excellent. I'm going to give this model an A because Subaru seems to really focus on not just dealing with large road imperfections like some of the potholes or the speed bumps that may be out there, or rougher roads like I'm on here, but also making sure that some of the smaller imperfections like freeway expansion joints, etc., don't come all the way into the cabin. You'll notice that even over bigger bumps like I just went over there, this suspension does really well. It doesn't feel brittle over that broken pavement. It doesn't get really crashy like some suspensions can either. In addition to that, Subaru gives us a fully independent suspension, including in the back. And that's something that we don't find in the Mazda 3, interestingly enough. The Mazda 3 definitely becomes more upset than this over broken pavement, although it's certainly going to feel more engaging and more dynamic. It is definitely more fun to drive, but it's not necessarily as composed as the Crosstrek. If you're looking for a vehicle in this segment that's going to be really great for long distance travel, say you want to do a road trip or you just have a really long daily commute, this is going to be an excellent option. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I measured 73 decibels in here, making this relatively average for the compact sedan and compact hatch category. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a B- when it comes to the cabin noise. You will find a few quieter options out there, most notably the more expensive options, unfortunately. So something like the Honda Civic is relatively civilized out on the road, as is the new Toyota Prius. I think the Prius is a reasonable alternative for someone that's maybe a bit more focused on long-term operational costs rather than the short-term acquisition costs, because that Prius could get you easily double the fuel economy that we find in this model. Now, that said, fuel economy has been pretty darn good over a week of mixed driving in this vehicle. So far, I've been averaging 31.5 miles per gallon, which is definitely excellent for an all-wheel drive vehicle. Remember that you might find some competitors with better fuel economy, but they're very unlikely to be all-wheel drive. So you could get better fuel economy in an Elantra hybrid or in a regular Honda Civic with the base engine and the CVT. It's going to be slightly better than this, but they're not going to be all-wheel drive either. You will, of course, get better fuel economy in the Corolla all-wheel drive hybrid, but that all-wheel drive hybrid system is quite different. This vehicle doesn't have the ability to send more than about 50% of power to the rear unless the front wheels slip, and even then it's not going to be an enormous amount of power to the rear, but that is always going to be significantly more than you could get to the back in a Prius all-wheel drive or in a Corolla all-wheel drive because of the design of that rear electric motor in those systems. They really designed those systems to help get you going from a stop, help get you unstuck from very minor situations. They didn't intend it to be a full-time system like we find in this Subaru, so the feeling is going to be quite different. And that's how we get to the excellent fuel economy numbers in the Impreza. So everything together is why this gets 33 miles per gallon, has the standard all-wheel drive, etc. You have to keep the price tag and that reality in mind when you compare this to the competition. Perhaps the best way to think of the Impreza is that this is the more on-road focused version of the Crosstrek. Obviously, the two vehicles feel quite similar out on the road, but because this has a lower center of gravity and less ground clearance and a different suspension design, it certainly does feel tighter out on a winding mountain road like this. You can certainly drive this harder than you could the Subaru Crosstrek. But it's not going to be an overtly sporty option. The steering is always going to be relatively numb. It certainly doesn't have the kind of engagement that you find in the Mazda 3. The suspension has a high level of polish, unlike the rear suspension in the Mazda 3, but that doesn't mean this is going to be more fun to drive. The Mazda 3 is an absolute hoot and a half, especially if you get the turbocharged engine. And remember, the Mazda 3 has optional all-wheel drive, but also remember that the Mazda 3 is pretty expensive, and if you want all-wheel drive and all of the extra features, it gets even more expensive. So certainly not really a direct competitor to the Impreza, especially the lower-end trims. I know I keep saying it, but the Impreza is pretty inexpensive for 2024, starting at $24,085. There are only 3 trims. Next up from there, we get the Sport. That gives you the 18-inch wheels, the bigger LCD in the dashboard, the fog lights, and push-button start, but it's a pretty decent pricing bump, $26,480. I really appreciate the level of standard feature content that Subaru gives us in the base model. The CVT is standard. The steering headlights are standard. All the active safety stuff except blind spot monitoring is also standard. So if you're looking for a vehicle, perhaps for a young driver, someone to send off to college in, etc., and you have the cash, clearly that's going to be a factor, then the Impreza is a really solid option. It has a practical cargo area in the back. It has a ton of active safety tech on it. If you want a moonroof or blind spot monitoring, you can add them to the Sport trim. That's going to be an extra $1,900. The blind spot monitoring becomes standard on the RS. The RS is also a pretty big jump, up to nearly $29,000, $28,975 starting. And then if you want the moonroof and the power seat and the Harman Kardon audio system on that model, it's going to be about an extra $2,000, taking you all the way up to $31,440 if you want the Smurf blue paint job to go with it. Now, this model is the only one that's going to give you the wider tires, heated seats. Those are optional in the Sport, but they're standard in the RS. The leather steering wheel, this is the only way to get that particular feature, and the rear USB ports. Why USB ports rather than rear seat air vents? I don't know. Personally, I think I would have preferred rear seat air vents because, again, we do find those in other world market versions of the Impreza, essentially, just not in the United States, and I am surprised by that. Hopefully that is something that Subaru rectifies in a mid-cycle refresh. But the Impreza still compares very, very well with the competition, so let's roll through that now. Obviously, the first competitor has to be the Corolla, $22,995 base, but that's sedan and front-wheel drive, so it is a little bit less expensive, but you're not getting quite the same thing. If you want the hybrid, it's going to be a little bit more expensive than the Impreza, $24,395, but still a sedan and still front-wheel drive. On the other hand, the fuel economy and the reliability reputation, both absolutely fantastic in that model. If you want the hatchback trim, you're going to be paying more than the Impreza, $24,450. Still front-wheel drive, and rather unfortunately, all-wheel drive is not available on the hatch at this point in time outside the GR Corolla, and you can't get the hybrid system in the hatch for whatever reason. You should also know that the Corolla hatch is really a tight squeeze. Because of the way that Toyota designed this particular generation Corolla platform, it lost a lot of space inside, I have to say. That's something that I've noticed in a lot of recent Toyota redesigns. The interior space has actually shrunk a bit, and it's really noticeable in the Corolla. It is very tight. If you routinely put larger folks in the back, child seats, kids in booster seats, especially some of those taller kids that maybe still need to use booster seats, this is going to be a major consideration for the Corolla. Also, the cargo area, it doesn't appear quite as small on paper as it does in person. It's not the most practical cargo area in the back. However, $25,795 would get you a hybrid LE all-wheel drive sedan with fantastic fuel economy. If you treat that gently, you will get double the fuel economy of the Impreza. So for folks out there that are really looking for low cost of acquisition and low cost of operation, the hybrid all-wheel drive versions of the Corolla are certainly within the pricing range of the Impreza. You're going to have to give up some of the rear seat capacity, especially rear seat headroom, and the rear seat and rear cargo capacity that you find in the Impreza. But I think for a lot of folks, that's going to be a decent trade-off. A little bit more of a problem is going to be the smaller screen format that we find in the Corolla and the fact that
honestly, it comes across as a little bit boring. Certainly not as entertaining or as engaging or as different as the Impreza. Because not that many people are buying Imprezas, it's probably going to be one of the few you'll find on the road. Now, that said, there are going to be a ton of Crosstreks on the road, so we might as well talk about that model now. When you look at the feature content, the Crosstrek is going to cost about $2,000, more than the Impreza all the way across the lineup. But there are more variations available in the Crosstrek because it sells in much bigger volume. So we get the 5 different trims: base, premium, those both use the 2-liter engine. Then we get sport, limited, and wilderness with the 2.5. If you want the slightly faster 0 to 60 time, thanks to the more aggressive final drive ratio, the all-terrain tires, the off-roady bits, etc., all of that look, that's going to be on the wilderness trim, and it is going to be the most expensive model. Sport versus the RS trim, this is kind of interesting because they're both about the same price, about $2,000 more expensive in the Crosstrek. They're going to be about the same performance. They're going to have almost identical feature sets, etc. But the $2,000 extra for the Crosstrek goes to the slightly different front end that we get in that model. Obviously, all of that cladding that I mentioned before, and the roof rails, which are a little bit different than what we find in the Impreza. Subaru said that the roof structure of the vehicle is essentially the same in these models, but the roof rails and their attachment points were designed differently for the Crosstrek. And that allows the Crosstrek to handle more cargo capacity up there, roof load, roof tent load, etc. So if you do plan on doing those sorts of things, you might want to get the Crosstrek, or you might want to just invest in some different load bars and different attachment mechanisms for the regular Impreza. If you're stationary, it probably should be fine. If you're rolling down the road and you want to have a bigger, heavier item up there, then you should probably go with the Crosstrek and the load bars that are made from the factory to support it. The Impreza is a solid value in the compact hatch segment, whether or not you value all-wheel drive. But clearly the value proposition is going to be better the more value you put on that all-wheel drive system. And I should mention that if you're not sure if you need all-wheel drive, or you know you don't need all-wheel drive, you might want to look at some of the other options, because long-term maintenance costs are definitely going to be higher on an all-wheel drive vehicle. There's simply more to maintain. So compared to something like a Toyota Corolla, even if the Impreza's engine and transmission were just as reliable as the Corolla's, you're still going to have maintenance costs associated with the rear differential, the power takeoff unit in the vehicle, etc. That's all going to have some maintenance cost associated with it effectively. And there may be additional higher insurance costs as well. So certainly keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that real-world fuel economy could be a little bit higher in the front-wheel drive competition, but here Subaru has done an excellent job at trying to level that playing field out. Now, aside from that, the Impreza is really a strong contender because it has a big roomy interior and a big cargo area in the back and solid fuel economy. Also, lots of active safety tech. This is the kind of vehicle that's very easy to live with. It may not be the most exciting. I'm certainly not as excited about the Impreza as some of the competition. And I think that the RS name was just kind of a weird thing to put on this particular Impreza. They should have called it the Sport, should have called it something else. Resurrecting the RS name to put on, a small hatch with mediocre performance just seems kind of weird to me. But that aside, I think the Impreza is a solid value. Let me know what you think about it down there in the comment section below, because I think that RS in this generation really does stand for really slow. See all of you later.